The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the quiet office. James Carter sat at his mahogany desk, staring at the framed photo of his family. His wife, Laura, smiled brightly in the picture, their two children, Lily and Ethan, perched on either side of her. It was a snapshot of perfection. The loving father, the devoted wife, the happy children. But lately, something about the picture felt off. James couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was Laura's growing distance over the past few months, or the occasional defensiveness when he asked simple questions. Or perhaps it was the nagging doubt planted by his friend and colleague, Richard, who offhandedly commented, "Ethan doesn't look much like you, does he?" James brushed it off at first. Ethan, at 8, had Laura's lighter complexion and almond-shaped eyes. Genetics, he thought. But the comment lingered, quietly stirring doubts he didn't want to acknowledge. One day, those doubts became impossible to ignore. It began innocently. James had gone for his routine physical, and his doctor recommended a genetic test to check for hereditary conditions. "It's good to know these things," Dr. Peterson said with a smile. On a whim, James decided to test the whole family. For health purposes, he told Laura over dinner. She hesitated, her fork freezing mid-air for a second before she nodded. The test kits arrived a week later. It was almost fun, swabbing their cheeks together as a family activity. Ethan giggled when he accidentally swabbed too hard, and Lily, ever the serious 10-year-old, made a game of ensuring everyone followed the instructions perfectly. Laura, however, seemed distracted. "Everything okay?" James asked one evening as they prepared for bed. She shrugged, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, climbing into bed and turning her back to him. James tried to dismiss it. Laura had been under stress with work, and he didn't want to seem paranoid. But a sliver of unease began to burrow its way into his heart, growing with each passing day. The results arrived 3 weeks later, and James eagerly opened the email. The report was long, filled with charts and graphs, but one section stood out: paternity results. James blinked, his pulse quickening. Ethan Carter, excluded as biological father. Lily Carter, excluded as biological father. The words didn't make sense. His eyes scanned the page again and again, hoping for a mistake. He double-checked the names, the dates, everything. But the cold, clinical report remained the same. James sat there, frozen, as the world he thought he knew crumbled around him. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there was a mix-up at the lab? He would call them first thing in the morning. But deep down, he knew there was no error. He thought about Laura's hesitation, her recent distance, and the subtle ways she had deflected his questions about her past. For hours, he sat in the darkened living room, the DNA report clutched in his trembling hands. Morning brought no clarity. The lab confirmed the results were accurate. James thanked the technician in a hollow voice before hanging up. The day passed in a blur. He avoided Laura, unsure of what to say. His mind raced with questions. Who was the father? How long had she been lying? Did she ever love him? That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, James couldn't help but watch Laura more closely. Every smile, every laugh felt rehearsed, like a performance. He looked at his children, so full of life and unaware of the storm brewing around them. "Everything okay, Dad?" Lily asked, noticing his distracted demeanor. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at work." But in his mind, James had already begun to formulate a plan. He needed answers, and he would get them. The days following the DNA results were a blur of suppressed rage and sleepless nights. James alternated between staring at the report and replaying the past decade in his mind. Every memory with Laura, every milestone with the kids, felt tainted. Was it all a lie? He knew he couldn't confront her without evidence. If there was one thing James had learned from his corporate career, it was to never enter a fight unprepared. So, he began to dig. James started with Laura's phone. She had always been careful about locking it, but after years of marriage, he knew her passcode. Late one night, when she was asleep, he unlocked it and scrolled through her messages. At first, there was nothing unusual. Conversations with her friends, work-related texts, and family group chats. But then he found an archived conversation with a contact saved only as D. The messages were innocuous at first, discussions about work and casual banter. But the further he scrolled, the more intimate they became. Phrases like, "I can't stop thinking about you," and "What if James finds out?" jumped out like daggers to his heart. James's hands trembled as he read the thread. The messages dated back nearly a decade, around the time Ethan was born. His chest tightened, his breathing shallow. This was no casual fling. This was an affair that had spanned years. He took screenshots of everything and forwarded them to his email. He needed a record. The next day, James hired a private investigator. If he was going to confront Laura, he needed the full picture. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, assured him she would find out everything. "Affairs leave trails," she said confidently. "People are sloppy. They don't cover their tracks as well as they think." Within days, Rachel uncovered more than James had expected. D, whose full name was David Turner, was an old colleague of Laura's from her previous job. The affair had started shortly after Laura returned from maternity leave with Lily. They had maintained contact through email, burner phones, and occasional out-of-town work trips. Rachel also discovered financial irregularities, hotel stays, unexplained withdrawals, and even gifts charged to a credit card James didn't know Laura had. James struggled most with his feelings toward Lily and Ethan. He adored them. They were his world. But every time he looked at them now, he saw David's shadow. It wasn't their fault. He knew that. Yet, the betrayal cut so deep it was hard to separate his anger at Laura from his heartbreak for the kids. One evening, Ethan ran into the living room, holding a picture he'd drawn at school. "Look, Dad. It's us," he said proudly. The drawing showed James, Laura, Lily, and Ethan standing together under a bright sun. "That's amazing, buddy," James said, forcing a smile. "Do you like it?" Ethan asked, his wide eyes searching for approval. "I love it," James replied, pulling him into a hug. But as he held his son, a wave of grief crashed over him. He wasn't Ethan's father, not biologically. And yet, in that moment, he realized something profound. They are still my children. I raised them, I love them, and nothing can change that. James knew the time to confront Laura was drawing near. He rehearsed the conversation in his mind, running through every possible scenario. Would she deny it? Beg for forgiveness? Try to turn it around on him? One evening, he decided to test her. Over dinner, he casually brought up the DNA test. "Dr. Peterson was right about those genetic tests," he said. The results were interesting. Laura froze for a split second before recovering with a smile. "Oh, what did they say?" "Just the usual stuff," James replied, watching her closely. "But it's amazing what they can find out these days. Even paternity." Laura's fork clattered onto her plate. Her eyes darted to James, then to the kids, before she quickly composed herself. "Why would they test that?" she asked, her voice too casual. James leaned back, studying her. "They didn't. But it's interesting to think about, isn't it?" She didn't respond, instead busily clearing the table. But her reaction told James everything he needed to know. That night, James finalized his plan. He wasn't just going to confront Laura. He was going to expose her. She had lied to him for years, stolen his chance to be a father to children that were biologically his, and humiliated him. Now, she was going to face the consequences. He reached out to Rachel to gather one final piece of evidence, confirmation of David's paternity. If Laura thought she could manipulate her way out of this, she was wrong. The night James decided to confront Laura, the house was unusually quiet. The kids were asleep, their soft breaths audible through the baby monitors James still insisted on keeping in their rooms. Laura sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone, unaware of the storm about to descend. James entered the room and stood by the doorway for a moment, watching her. A pang of sadness swept over him. He had loved this woman, built a life with her, sacrificed for her. And now, everything felt like a lie. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Laura looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" James crossed the room, placing a folder on the coffee table. "This." Laura hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents. The DNA test results, the screenshots of her messages with David, and Rachel's report detailing the affair. Her face went pale. "James, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling. "Explain what?" he snapped, his composure breaking. "Explain how you've been lying to me for over a decade? How you've let me raise children that aren't even mine without ever telling me the truth? Go ahead, Laura. I'd love to hear your explanation." Tears welled in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" James's voice rose. "A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. This is a betrayal. You cheated on me, lied to me, and dragged me into a life built on your lies." Laura broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said between gasps. "David and it was just one time at first. But then things got complicated, and I didn't know how to stop. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know if the baby was his or yours. I was scared, James. I didn't want to lose you." "So you lied," James said coldly. "I was going to tell you," she pleaded. "But then Lily was born, and I saw how happy you were. And when Ethan came along, I couldn't bear to destroy our family." "Destroy our family?" James laughed bitterly. "Laura, you destroyed it the moment you decided to keep this from me." Laura looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I love you, James. You're their father in every way that matters." James shook his head. "Am I? Because right now, I feel like nothing more than a fool who believed in a lie." Laura reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The betrayal had severed something fundamental between them, something that couldn't be repaired with empty words. "James, please," she whispered. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through it. For the kids." "For the kids," James repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. "Do you even realize what you've done to them? They have a right to know the truth, Laura. And you've stolen that from them." Laura's sobs grew louder. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave us." James stared at her, his jaw clenched. He had envisioned this moment so many times, but now that it was here, the weight of it was crushing. "You don't get to decide what happens next," he said finally. "Not anymore." The doorbell rang, breaking the tense silence. Laura looked at him, confused, but James didn't flinch. He walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was Rachel, holding a folder in her hand. "Everything you asked for," Rachel said, handing it over. "Who is this?" Laura asked, panic creeping into her voice. James ignored her, flipping through the folder. It contained the paternity test results for both children, comparing David's DNA to theirs. As expected, both Lily and Ethan were biologically David's. James held up the results for Laura to see. "Here's the truth you couldn't bring yourself to tell me." Laura's face crumpled as she sank to the floor. "I'm done, Laura," James said, his voice firm. "You've had control of this narrative for too long, but not anymore. Tomorrow, I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going to make sure you feel the weight of every lie you've told." "You can't do this," Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You'll destroy our family." "You destroyed it," James replied. "Now it's time to face the consequences." The days following James's confrontation with Laura were a whirlwind of legal consultations, tense conversations, and emotional turmoil. James moved into the guest room, unable to share a bed with her any longer. The once lively home had turned cold, the laughter of their children now a painful reminder of what had been lost. For the kids' sake, James and Laura tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but even Lily and Ethan could sense the tension. James struggled with how much to tell the children. On the one hand, they were innocent in all this, blameless victims of Laura's deception. On the other, they deserved the truth, at least some version of it. One evening, he sat down with Lily and Ethan in the living room. Laura lingered in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "There's something we need to talk about," James began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with fear. James's heart ached at her question. "We are," he admitted gently. "But I want you both to know that I love you so much. That will never change." Ethan looked confused. "Then why can't we stay together?" "It's complicated," James said, his voice breaking. He glanced at Laura, who looked away, unable to meet his eyes. But what's important is that we're still a family, no matter what. He didn't mention the paternity tests. Deciding the truth about their biological father could wait until they were older. For now, he wanted them to feel secure in his love, even as their world was falling apart. Laura was a shell of her former self. Guilt weighed on her like a physical burden, and she spent most days in their bedroom, avoiding James's accusatory stares. She made several attempts to reconcile, leaving him tearful notes and trying to initiate conversations about therapy or forgiveness. But James couldn't bring himself to engage. "You don't get to rewrite the narrative now," he told her one evening after she cornered him in the kitchen. "I'm not trying to rewrite anything," she replied, her voice desperate. "I'm just trying to fix it." James shook his head. "Some things can't be fixed, Laura. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the life we built together. And I can't come back from that." James debated whether to confront David. The man had not only slept with his wife, but fathered his children, knowingly or not. He decided he needed answers. Through Rachel, James obtained David's contact information and arranged to meet him at a local cafe. David was a tall, confident man with an air of casual arrogance that grated on James instantly. "You must be James," David said, extending a hand. James ignored it. "I'm not here to exchange pleasantries. I want to know how long you've known those kids are yours." David's smirk faltered. "Look, I didn't know for sure until recently. Laura and we had a thing, but she always insisted they were yours." "Convenient," James said coldly. "Did it ever occur to you to take responsibility?" David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want from me? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. But Laura made her choices, just like I did." James clenched his fists under the table. "You don't get to shrug this off. Those kids think I'm their father because I've been the one raising them. But now, thanks to both of you, everything's falling apart." David looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving James more determined than ever to protect Lily and Ethan from the fallout. The divorce proceedings began quickly. Laura begged James to settle amicably, but he refused to let her dictate terms. "I'm not out to hurt you," he told her during a tense meeting with their lawyers. "But I'll fight to ensure Lily and Ethan's lives are as stable as possible." James pushed for primary custody, arguing that Laura's deceit and ongoing emotional instability made her unfit to provide a stable home environment. Laura fought back, claiming that her mistakes didn't make her a bad mother. The court proceedings were grueling, each session reopening wounds James thought had begun to heal. Ultimately, the judge awarded James primary custody, citing his role as the children's primary caregiver and the stable environment he could provide. Laura was granted visitation rights, but the victory felt hollow. James hated that the children were being dragged through the mess of their parents' choices. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, James sat in the living room, staring at the same family photo that had sparked his doubts months ago. So much had changed since then, and yet, his love for Lily and Ethan remained unwavering. They weren't his biological children, but they were his children in every way that mattered. He had been there for their first steps, their first words, their birthdays and milestones. James made a silent vow to himself. No matter what had happened, he would never let them feel unloved or abandoned. Months passed, and the storm that had engulfed James's life began to settle. The divorce was finalized, and James retained primary custody of Lily and Ethan. The house felt emptier without Laura, but it was also calmer, free from the tension and secrets that had poisoned their marriage. James threw himself into building a new life for himself and the kids. Mornings became their time to bond, with James cooking pancakes and helping with school projects. Evenings were spent reading bedtime stories or playing board games. Slowly, they began to form a new routine, one rooted in honesty and love. Lily and Ethan adapted better than James had expected. Children were resilient, he realized, and their unconditional love for him remained steadfast. Laura wasn't content with being sidelined in her children's lives. She used her visitation time to shower them with affection and tried to mend her relationship with James. One afternoon, she asked to meet James privately at a park near their old neighborhood. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her voice subdued, "but I want to make things right. For the kids. James nodded, his face unreadable. I appreciate that. But making things right isn't about us anymore. It's about them. They need stability, Laura. They need to trust that the people in their lives won't let them down. Laura's eyes filled with tears. I'm trying, James. I really am. I hope you are, he replied. Because they deserve better than what we gave them. David remained a peripheral figure. Despite his attempts to reach out, James kept him at arm's length. He allowed supervised visits with the children, recognizing that they had a right to know their biological father, but he made it clear that David would never replace him. I'm their dad, James told David during one of their tense meetings. Not because of biology, but because I've been there for them every day of their lives. If you're going to be in their lives, you need to respect that. David nodded, though the tension between them never fully dissipated. As the months turned into a year, James knew it was time to have a more honest conversation with Lily and Ethan. He wanted them to hear the truth from him, not piece it together from whispers or accidental revelations. One evening, after dinner, he sat them down at the kitchen table. There's something I need to tell you, he began, his voice steady but gentle. It's about your mom and me, and about your family. Lily and Ethan listened intently as James explained, in age-appropriate terms, the truth about their biological father. He reassured them repeatedly that his love for them hadn't changed and never would. You're my kids, he said firmly. No matter what, that will always be true. Ethan climbed onto his lap, wrapping his small arms around James's neck. You're the best dad ever, he whispered. Lily, more contemplative, nodded. You've always been there for us, she said. That's what matters. James held them close, a deep sense of relief washing over him. In time, life began to feel normal again, albeit a new version of normal. James found solace in the small victories. Watching Lily excel at soccer, helping Ethan with his science projects, and creating new traditions for their little family. Laura's relationship with the kids improved as she worked to rebuild their trust. While things between her and James remained strained, they found a way to co-parent effectively. David's involvement remained limited. He visited occasionally, but the bond between him and the children never matched the one they shared with James. One quiet evening, after the kids had gone to bed, James sat at his desk and began to write a letter. It was addressed to Lily and Ethan, to be given to them when they were older. He poured his heart onto the page, recounting the journey they had been through together. He wrote about his love for them, the pain of the betrayal, and the resilience they had shown as a family. I want you to know, he wrote, that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, commitment, and being there for each other, no matter what. You are my greatest joy, and I'm so proud to be your dad. James wasn't the same man he had been before the DNA test turned his world upside down. The betrayal had broken him in many ways, but it had also forged a stronger version of himself. He had learned to navigate pain, to fight for what mattered, and to find peace in the love he shared with his children. As he tucked them in one night, watching their peaceful faces as they drifted off to sleep, he realized that while his life hadn't turned out the way he had planned, it was still a life worth living. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. His future was with Lily and Ethan, building a life rooted in truth, love, and resilience.